to open, most of you are old hands at this, or not so old hands, but you've done this for a while. And, we have 16 days and 6 hours and 54 minutes before the grants are due in New York State. So you should be buckling down, pulling stuff together. Dov, you want to start with procurement, and then we'll get to NSGP questions?
Good morning, everybody. We realize we're the day before Pesach, but we didn't want to not show up on our regular allocated time frame. So what we want to do today is kind of do a roll-up, of our flow chart that we've created from the procurement side, and as well as we have David available and ourselves for the questions about the upcoming NSGP application, obviously due on April 20th, right? So we have Pesach right smack in the middle. So we don't, not to confuse it, let's recognize that, we're talking about two different sides of the coin here. The procurement flow chart is once you have the grant, once you have won an award, the requirements, the contractual requirements you need to do to use this government funding appropriately, right? If it's the NSGP, there's federal and state requirements. The hate crimes grant, right? There's the state requirements, but very similar type of steps you need to do, but there's some differences. And as well as the actual, like we said, we'll get back to David and we'll be available for questions on this federal nonprofit security grant program where the applications are due April 20th. But I think even if you're here for the NSGP questions, right, for applying for questions, and you listen to how we've developed the flow chart, you'll know what you're getting yourself into, right? A lot of people it's so much work to apply. There's a pre-qualification and the IJ, etc. I'll say this, there's probably more work on the back end. So if you were to be awarded, there's a lot of work, there's a lot of steps to do it correctly. I don't think it's anything that's impossible to do. We've helped many locations move through the funds. Many of the grant writers on the call, etc., are familiar. The people who've been through this process are familiar. Use that knowledge to know what's going to be on the backside if you do apply. But just recognize we're talking about two sides of both applying for the NSGP and the flow chart. Now, remember, this is our guidance from experience, from helping locations navigate the grants, helping locations both from the application side, the award side, procurement side. But for your real official answers, make sure you have that relationship with your rep, you follow your contractual obligations. That is the final say. We just want to be able to kind of talk within the gray lines. We want to be able to answer some of those questions a little more directly than maybe your rep will. It gets a little confusing. Those of you who have been on these webinars with us, we're really trying to keep it clear for everybody, but there are two grants out there, right? If you follow our earlier sessions, right, we kind of specify the NSGP versus the hate crimes grant, right? The SCAHC, Securing Communities Against Hate Crimes grant, right? There's similarities, but there's differences. We want to be able to help you understand those differences. Some of you might have both grants. Some of you who are now applying or maybe just applied for the hate crimes grant, maybe now you can have a little bit of a window into what's expected for you on the other side. But what we want to do is create this flow chart, which we've presented over the past few weeks as we've built up. And don't worry about the details on the slide because we're going to step through it. But we want to create these steps so you can understand really that step-by-step process. We think it's easier than an 80-page PowerPoint slide deck of rules and the contract you have. Kind of create this in chewable bites. One thing we always advise is remember, these are our created phases. If you go back to your rep, whether it's at DHSES or DCJS, and tell them you're in phase whatever, they'll have no idea what you're talking about. Kind of why we added the titles to the phases, but just it's for you to understand your steps, your flow. Maybe we give you some links where to find it within provided material from the government agencies. But let's move forward. One thing I also did was Jamie Matos, who's on the call today and has been on many of the calls, and if any of you have done one-on-one consulting type calls with us, she's been a partner of mine here. So if I get off track or she has a good question, she's going to pipe in and make sure we're clear, right? Like we said, we have a smaller session today as expected, Eve of Passover, a lot of other holidays coming up. So we just wanted to make sure we can do this recap, kind of clarify things. But please remember, we have our archives where we talk about pretty much each of these steps what we're calling phases in detail, which we won't get in as much detail today. But the first thing you can see on this comparison slide between the two grants, right? The federal nonprofit security grant program, still administered by the state, so it gets confusing, and also the state, New York State Securing Community Against Hate Crimes grant, right? So very similar, as you can almost see. We've tried to create it like that, but there are some small differences. One thing we've talked about over previous weeks, where you heard from Ilya, who was not able to join us this week, was about assigning a project manager. We have seen it time and time again where the roles change hands and people forget. I mean, Jamie and I have done some calls, direct calls in the last few weeks, where we had to remind them that if you had the federal grant and your EHP has already been approved, we'll talk about it in a moment if you're not familiar, you can't just put your installations wherever you want. You're kind of got to make sure your installations line up with what was been approved. We can't just create willy-nilly now that we're past these stages and do whatever we want. There might be a better placement hypothetically, and you could work with your reps to change it, but your EHP is where your approved installations are, and now that's the next step, is to follow that approved plan. Remember, just notice the top of the slides. We're specifying which grant we're talking about. For example, if you are now applying for your first NSGP, what will be expected once you are awarded the grant. Meaning, if you apply now, end of April, they'll probably notify of award winners, around September of this year usually. Then it takes a few weeks, a few months to turn your paperwork around and even get to the next step. So even if you apply for this April 20th, you're likely not making any next real movement till next year, 2024, right? So if you have not applied and have not won an award, this does not apply to you yet, but it will. For those of you who want to hear more about the steps, the flowchart, which we've been talking about the last few weeks, this is kind of that breakdown of step by step. So the first step, our phase one, what we call it, CSI calls it phase one, is executing your contract, right? So now if you see in this slide here, we link to where you can find more detailed information, because there's no way we can cover every detail and everything you must do to ensure you're following the rules in this simple flowchart. On the top of the page, there's a link, right? You can see dhses.ny.gov/nonprofit-programs. On that page, whether for the NSGP or the hate crimes grant, you will have links to their webinars, to their slide decks. We're not here to reinvent the wheel. We just want to kind of massage it, clarify a few things, and be available to everybody as we've always been.
It's important to remember, whatever they say is the last word.
Exactly.
We can clarify stuff. That's what we're in the business of trying to clarify. We are in the business to ask questions. We kind of understand what's happening, but they are the last word.
Why we have our disclaimer, why we mention that. And many of our calls, we'll be able to answer some things, but we'll often tell many people, you need to go back to your rep. You need to ask, and we'll help you maybe word the question so you can get the appropriate answer you need. But make sure you have that link to their slide decks. We kind of spell out where specifically you can find, right? It says, if you have the 2021 grant, it's on page 15 to 23. If you have the 22 grant, it's on page 4 to 16. And then we have a link to e-grants. In e-grants is where you would actually do your contract execution, where you do a lot of your quarterly progress reports, something we haven't really talked about yet, and where you can kind of manage your program. All right, so that's executing / signing your grant. So let's take a look at hate crimes grant, right? We call it hate crimes grant, securing communities against hate crimes. Same link. Now for the DHSES slide deck, let's be clear. The last grant cycle, a new agency, well, not a new agency, but a new agency for these grants, the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services now manages, is the administrator of the hate crimes grant. So the contracts that you get with the state, whether for the hate crimes grant or for the NSGP, are very similar. So what we've done is we learned from the materials that DHSES puts out to guide us on the hate crimes grant steps, because it's still based on what you've contractually obligated to do. However, DCJS has not put out as much guidance, so there's often a lot more questions to ask them. And to be honest, our phase one estimated of 0 to 3 months is much bigger. It's taken many organizations much more time just to get responsiveness out of DCJS. If you've been on our earlier webinars, we said one of the most important things you can do is start chipping away at your rep saying, hey, we got this award. We want to move forward. What's our next step? Here's what we have, just the squeaky wheel, right? Fortunately, they're still getting all their ducks in a row. I think we'll be in good hands in time, but till then, we just don't want to lose time on the hate crimes grant is only a 2-year award period versus the NSGP, which is actually 3. But nonetheless, your first step is executing your contract. You can't move forward spending the money if you don't execute the contract. Now, if you did the grant through DCJS, actually, you're not using e-grants, you're using what's called Grants Management System, GMS, very similar to e-grants. So if you have both grants, you'll see they're very similar systems, but if you have a newer hate crimes award, you're going to be using GMS, not e-grants. Nonetheless, you can get some guidance from the DHSCS slide deck for hate crimes grants. Again, recognize if you have a DCJS award, if they're the agency that's working with you, they might have little different nuances. My personal, what I've seen so far, what we've seen so far, is that they're a little bit laxer, a little bit more lenient than DHSCS. Nonetheless, we're going to advise based on DHSCS rules because it does line up with what the contract says. There's not extra filler stuff. It's stuff you have to do based on your contract. So far, so good, Jamie? You're speaking for the people. All right. I know there's a lot of dancing between these grants, between the agencies. We really try to pull that out in the first few webinars. So if this is confusing, please see our recordings. But I want to make sure we move through this in due time, but just give that kind of full step-by-step. And that's our advice, really. All this stuff, just whether you're applying or you're on this side doing the procurement, spending your award, approach it step-by-step. Don't try to bite off everything at one time. It's very important. And that's also why we have the stop sign there. Really, without contract execution, you really should not be moving forward to the next step. Which is now, this is where we start, where the two grants start breaking away. If you have the federal award, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, right? You might call it the FEMA grant, the federal grant. You can look at your contract if you're not sure which one you have. At this point, we really should be confident about what grant we have, how much the award was, when our deadline for the contract is, right? Those basics, you really should have that. It's all in your contract. Ask your rep, reach out to us. We'll help you figure it out. But this is where the two grants start deviating. The federal grant requires the AHP, Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation. And this is a FEMA requirement. So your state administrator at DHSCS will help you make your EHP package, submit it to FEMA, and then we wait for FEMA to review it and get back to us. Maybe they'll have questions, maybe it'll be good to go. But this can take several months. And if you ever require changes down the road to your actual installation, you're moving funds, you decide one project's more important than the other, you might have to submit a new AHP, which could add a few more months back into your timeline. So just be mindful of that. Again, without the EHP, you cannot move forward. DHSCS will not let you move forward without your contract execution and your EHP in place. And that's waiting for the approval. We have a whole session, maybe 2 actually, of the EHP, how to submit it, how to provide the materials, the documents, the pictures, the forms. DHSCS provides information. You'll see if you find their PowerPoint deck for the 2022 NSGP part 1, because they break into 2 slide decks, page 17 to 27, right, talks about what is required for the EHP. And remember, this is only a requirement for the NSGP. If you were awarded the NSGP and now you've passed execution, your next step is EHP. If you have the hate crimes grant, you are not responsible for the EHP. So now we're actually going to start, the 2 grants will start linking up again. The next real step, once you have the first few steps in place, is you need to advertise in order to have what the state calls a fair and open competitive procurement process, right? The state is not going to be involved in the brands you use, how you install your security, to what specifications, right? That's up to what you requested in your grant award and how you design your RFP and work with your vendors to ensure the right materials and products. Granted, for the federal grant, there are some banned equipment that you cannot use, but other than that, they're not going to get involved in the actual security design specifications, etc. What they care about is that you follow the procurement process, which one of the most important steps is your advertisement in a local paper, not a religious paper, not a specific language, right? Those are the basics of it. Again, refer to the slide deck that they have on pages 12 to 13. It goes through it, or our previous webinar where we talk about this a little bit more in depth, and it needs to be up for 3 days, right? Some of the language you can argue, but at the end of the day, if you ask your rep, they'll say 3 days minimum. The big message that we add on top of it from CSI is that you likely will not get any responses from your advertisement. Possible, but it's very unlikely. What you should do is 2 things. 1, take your ad, a snippet, an image of your ad, and then you can share it. Once you put it in that ad, in the paper, and you find a vendor, maybe someone gave you a name, you looked online, you did a search for, camera companies, if that's what you're doing, then you can kind of share it further. The other thing you should do is share it with us. We can share it with our networks. We always are clear that we cannot recommend any vendors, but we can behind the scenes share it with some networks. They can then reach out directly to you. You do your due diligence. We'll talk about some of the required things you must do, but your due diligence to identify if this vendor can deliver for what you want. I see Moshe has a question. Why not? We're a small group today. Jamie, can you open up Moshe's mic?
When we advertise, what level of specifics? So, for example, blast protection on windows. Do we just say something like that, or do we have to get down into specifics of the material and the number of windows and all that?
For the advertisement, I would keep it to the template language that the state provides, and it's very generic. Window hardening, blast protection, nothing more than that. Your RFP, meaning, so now you're going to make your advertisement. You have a generic email for operational security, right? OPSEC. You don't want to tell them, you don't want to tell the public that you don't have security in place. So you have your general email. They'll respond, hey, we're interested. We saw your advertisement. We're interested. From there, you should then send your RFP or additional specs, additional design of what you are looking for in your project. So definitely not in the ad. The ad, just get that minimum requirement ad out, right? So you can tell your rep, hey, we did the advertisement. When they write back to you, when the vendor writes back, that's when you share a little bit more detail. When they do a walkthrough, provide a little bit more verbal detail. In terms of those spec designs, without getting too deep into it all, every vendor has a little bit of a different product, a little bit of a different capability. So make sure you don't pigeon yourselves completely into specific model and a specific brand and a specific capability. You could say or similar is the easy way. Many, how organizations do it with their security programs. If you are looking for something specific, that way you don't weed out anyone who just doesn't carry your brand or that spec that you want. If you say or similar is a simple way. In your RFP, though, that does not need to be in your advertisement. RFP, request for proposal, that's once they respond to your ad and you share your additional information.
And I'm reading directly from the state slide deck. An advertisement is a nonprofit organization in your city, New York, is seeking sealed bids for the sale and installation of security-related enhancements. This project includes, and then you kind of name the general categories that you're doing. The selection criterion will be based on as examples. And that's something that Dove has a separate consultant's corner on. Knowledge of surveillance and security, adherence to projected work schedule, prior experience, references, and cost. You might be able to, in consultation with your project manager, add things like knowledge of our current systems, because asking someone to add on to your current systems, you might include that as a criterion. Specifications and bid requirements can be obtained by contacting us at such and such a synagogue, such and such a school. Make it anonymous, at gmail.com. And all interested firms will be required to sign in for the proposed documents and provide a primary contact, telephone, and email address. Bids will be accepted and honor until, and work should be commenced by whatever.
If you didn't get that all down in your notes, everyone, that template that David's reading is in the DHSES PowerPoint. Page 12 and 13, you can see that exact language. We're not advising to go any bit further, any beyond that. We see another stop sign. Don't skip this step. It's a requirement in your contract. You can get technical, that technically the advertisements and sealed bids are only over a certain threshold of funds. Being that most of your awards are above that threshold, which is $10,000, we just talk across the board. There's no reason, because some project of yours is over that threshold. You need to advertise, you need to follow the process. You might as well just do it for all your projects. We in Consultants Corner do not get into the nuances. We treat everything like the sealed bid process. So for those of you who are aware, there are some nuances. We will not get into it. Let's just assume this is the way we have to do for all your projects. All right, so stop sign. You must advertise. It can be a small paper, Cranes, AM New York, Lohud in West, upstate, Brooklyn Eagle in Brooklyn. I think there's something in our town in Manhattan. Don't go crazy. It just cannot be a religious paper or a specific language or specific industry, something general that gets to everyone.
Can we ask providers what they would do, or must we specify some level of solution?
So when you create your RFP, and actually we'll talk a little bit about that in the next, as we pull back in this flow chart, but obviously you want to know it at the front end. For these projects, my personal opinion is talk end goal, because you want to allow the vendor who knows their equipment and their capabilities to say, oh, you want blast hardening. Well, actually, yeah, a lot of companies will offer you film. We have this other polycarbonate we can install that will do better or similar, right? So, and if anything, what I've seen was locations that come with very, very heavy RFPs, which in the real world, I would advise, if we're too detailed, it actually could scare away some of the vendors. There's the big companies out there, but they only want to bid on $500,000 projects, right? So you have to recognize the kind of vendors that we're getting for a 25 grand, 10 grand. It doesn't mean they're not capable or they're not qualified vendors. It's just their capacity to follow every step for a comprehensive RFP could be off-putting to them. So my personal advice is bullet out what you're trying to accomplish. We want cameras on the exterior to cover these certain things, and on the interior to cover these certain things. We want this much memory of our cameras, this much storage, but let them, everyone carries different brands and different abilities. So there are going to be some nuances. They get it really apples to apples is going to be a little tough, but if your vendors show you how they plan to approach and solve your problem, how you lay it out in your RFP, is I think the safest, smoothest solution here.
Remember that the goal of this is, from the state's point of view, it's fair and open competition. So anything you do for one, you have to do for the other. So it is possible, Moshe, to say, with your bid documents, we will schedule a walkthrough of the site on such and such a date, such and such a time, and give them a window between noon and 5. And remember, if someone comes up with a brilliant idea, whatever you do for one, if someone says, I want to do 23 cameras because you forgot to put a camera over there, and you would only had 20, you could recast. If you make changes in your bid document, Dove says do it at high level, but if you make changes, you have to send those changes to everybody.
Right. And more importantly, if you have a federal grant, your EHP only approved for certain installation locations, it's got to line up with that. So you're kind of pigeonholed, for lack of a better word, where the actual installs go. But that the EHP probably, hopefully, didn't get into the detailed specs. Otherwise, you'd have to follow the specs that you got approved first from FEMA. Again, I would refer back to both the state's DHSCS's materials and our previous webinars on those things. But let's get back to our flow chart here, because we're overspilling. We're back on a hate crimes page, right? So we switched back, and you see they have the same no EHP requirement, but you do still have to advertise for 3 days. You have to identify your vendors, and the MWBE requirement, the Minority and Women-Owned Business Enterprise requirement, 30% of your award. So $50,000 award, that's the hate crimes award, that's the max award. you need to spend 15,000 of it on MWBE. This is definitely beyond the scope of what we can get into today. Look at the DHSCS materials, our previous materials. At this point, the best move is get your advertisement and share it with us. Let us know your budget so we can figure out where you can get an actual MWBE vendor that we know is active in the field. The portal is hit or miss. The state that they want you to use to find vendors. It's very tough to navigate. The waiver should not even be considered. We really want to find the best way to get through this requirement is do it. We want to help you. We've helped many locations find MWBE vendors. There's not a ton that do the security specific work we're looking, right? Because these are right counterterrorism designs and anti-adversary for hate crimes designs, right? We're not just talking about basic upgrades. We want to do really security specific. So we want those kind of vendors. Nonetheless, this is kind of in your identify vendors, and if you have the hate crimes, the MWBE responsibility. So then we kind of turn the corner, right? So once you've advertised, and again, this bidding phase will be similar for the federal grant or the hate crimes grant. This page we're looking at is for the federal grant. Every project you have, you need to get 3 bids. If you have a door project, 3 door vendors. Camera, and then also cameras, you want 3 vendors, right? 3 bids for your cameras. Fencing, alarms, etc. Every line, and this is what people miss, is that you need those 3 bids for each budget line. Now, a company that does camera systems probably also does alarms and access control. That doesn't mean they can't bid on those. Just make sure they pull out those bids so that you see and you can show your records, your notes to your rep, if you ever get audited or whatever it may be, that you got 3 bids for every budget line, right? That's many times people struggle to get that. It is hard to get those bids, especially if you just relied on your newspaper advertisement and they go back and they say, hey, we only can get 1 bid, 2 bid. Is that okay? And our answer is, well, we can't speak to the state. Ask your rep, but we know the answer is going to be you need that 3rd bid. So again, once your ad is up, manually distribute it, take that snippet and image of your ad, share it with whoever you can find. Maybe you get names from other colleagues, other institutions, and as well as share it with us, your regional security director or me. 3 bids for every budget line project, right? You can't move forward to score them, to evaluate them, right? The sealed bid process until you have 3 bids. What is that scoring methodology and vendor selection? That sealed bid process. Basically, when you are ready to advertise, you should come up, and we've talked about this in previous sessions, you should come up with some sort of matrix, a basic Excel document, how you're going to basically score, weigh out, evaluate the vendors that submit bids so that you have, like David's been reiterating, a fair and open competition. You can score, responsiveness, pricing. If MWBE is important for the hate crimes grant, right? That gets some points system. Again, refer to our previous sessions where we do provide these examples and we walk through them a little bit more in depth, but that's again something that needs to go into your records and notes, and you'll see in this DHSCS materials what they tell you about how to mark it, how to keep it in your records. Page 9 and 14 of part 2 in the DHSCS materials. So now we're back to a hate crimes, so right, just to keep you guys on your toes, keep it confusing. We're looking at the hate crimes flow chart, very similar, but there are differences. And we're really all we add here is in your bidding phase, especially if you're working with DHSCS, because they have been much more strict than DCJS. They really do not want you moving forward with the rest of your grant award if your first 30% has not been allocated to a legitimate MWBE. If you haven't found that yet, you need to keep going that process. It takes a lot of time. It can eat up the first half of your contract period, just finding these vendors, but get that 30% piece taken care of before you move forward. I don't know if DCJS is as strict, but you still must meet that requirement at some point. But DHSCS did not allow you to move forward without meeting that requirement. Just a reminder that MWBE vendors have to be New York State approved through Empire State Development. It's because there's other MWBEs out there, so just be careful. There's New York City approved MWBEs and federal and military, so just be mindful that for these grants, the MWBE requirement must be accomplished with a New York State approved MWBE. They'll have a number that goes along with it. They'll have project descriptions to make sure it's that if it's a camera guy, they're not trying to install doors, right? The DHSES has also been very strict on making sure it's locations with the right commodity codes, what it's called, to install your project. So even if you find an MWBE, they have to have the right commodity codes or at least capabilities description so that they're the right vendors. Again, please refer to our previous slides and DHSCS slides on this. Again, we don't know how strict DCJS will be. So we have not yet, in our Consultants Corner series, gone into phase 5 yet. If you have one of the more recent grants, you're not there yet. I think some people are still in phase 1, especially for the hate crimes grant, no fault of their own. That's on DCJS. But we're looking again, just to be clear, back on the NSGP slide, your phase 5, what we call phase 5, what your installation, your equipment management, and the fiscal reimbursement. If you do get ahead and start looking at these forms, right? If you go to the DHSES slides and you look at these pages we're listing, you can start seeing the forms. You'll see they pointed out, fill in this part, information goes here. It's really stepped out. So we don't need to overthink, follow their guidance. But what I want to point out about our phase 5, again, this is a CSI phase 5. Your reps will have no idea what we're talking about. This could take a while, especially with supply chain issues. If you have door hardening, for example, in your project, besides just getting the bid, right? So you have your ad out, right? Again, separate timing, but just recognize all the time in these steps, your ad, responding, coordinating walkthroughs, then the back and forth to get with your vendor to design you want. That's taken a while. Let's say now you've actually designed it out, you've selected them, and you want to get those final designs out, you want to order it. It could take months for something like doors to even just arrive because of supply chain issues. And then, installation itself is usually pretty quick, but you have that supply chain demand. Other equipment does not usually take as long, but it could if you really want to create, design out your system once you select your vendor, and then they may have other obligations. You never know. So it could take a couple months, this phase alone. Technically, you have 30 days after your contract end date to submit the forms, but the entire project must be installed and up and running. We haven't talked about this phase yet in Consultants Corner. We will get there in due time. We try not to throw everything at everybody. Going through the whole flow chart, it feels like everything, but remember, we have stepped through it kind of in the phases over the previous weeks. And then same thing really with the hate crimes grant. The final phase for internal controls, grant records, the reimbursement, same kind of thing. Remember, you can submit, if you have done an installation, you can submit for reimbursement. It doesn't need to wait till the end, right? So if you were to spend some of your award in the legitimate manner, you can start submitting for reimbursement. You don't have to wait till every dollar is spent, but it needs to be spent, it needs to be installed, and that's what we'll talk about when we get to that installation piece. But for most people, we want to make sure we're not talking about that if the advertisement hasn't been up, if MWBE requirement hasn't been up. So without tripping ourselves up, that was very important for us to continue with the flow chart. But they're obviously, like we say, in this basic overview, it's hard to cover every nuance. Work closely with your rep, work closely with your regional security director from CSI, ourselves, ask the questions on these webinars. There's a lot of stuff that isn't super clear and needs, and the only way is having done it. So we want to make sure we stay that resource for you. We'll still be here. I want to make sure we finish it up right now. Just the flow chart process and overview. Please, again, refer to our previous slides. And we just wanted to make sure, because the application deadline is coming up for NSGP, that we're also available for any questions. There's no major updates on that. David gave the ticker as we started off today, how much time is left. But we wanted to make sure we're available for those questions in our remaining time here, as well as if any flowchart type questions, procurement questions, while we're here, without keeping everyone too long, as we know it's busy in Passover season. So any other questions? David, anything you want to share on the NSGP side, please feel free.
I don't have anything specifically because, all of the frequently asked questions have been frequently asked in previous years. If anyone has questions, we're here.
I'm going to jump in. Stephen, what location are you with?
North Shore Jewish Center in Port Jefferson.
It's Long Island, right?
Yeah, Port Jefferson, Long Island.
Have you worked with Lerone at all?
Yes, I've actually spoken to him. I actually met with him just within the last couple of weeks. You know, I've not worked extensively with him. He's actually been excellent with the person who's doing the application, who did the application that we won and who just actually submitted the application that just submitted for the next round. So there's a different person doing that, and he's worked a lot with her. As I said, I've spoken to him a few times and I've met with him. Yeah.
Who is your rep at DHSES?
Nicholas with a D,
Yeah.
I think. Nicholas.
I'm familiar.
Yeah.
That team's growing because there's more and more grants and more awards. So there's a lot of fresh faces, but you know, they have a real process. They know what they expect. Unlike the other grant where DCJS is getting their legs, this agency, DHSES, really knows what they expect and what they want. So you should be able to get a straight answer. And I have no problem being wrong about anything OGS. It is just what I've seen. So the best move is get clarification from them.
If you think they're wrong, let us know, and we'll either say, "Oh, we've heard that before," or we'll ask.
Yeah, it actually took a while. I had to fill out not a hard simple application, but I expected it to go very quickly, and for some reason it didn't. Took us several months, but then it came back with a letter, you know, authorizing us to have access to the contracts. So
I think that's the magic words here that we should all be aware of, that everything that seems like it should be quicker, just to every step. It's just been our experience, unless you've been through this before, right? Because some locations have received multiple grants. I'll say this, Stephen, if you get the next award and you're doing it again, you'll be a pro, right? So
yeah.
You'll come with new questions.
Even the EHP, I submitted at the end of December. Within like 2-3 weeks, I had a bunch of questions that came back from FEMA. What are you doing about this? What are you doing about that? What are you doing about the other thing? I figured, oh, this is great. You know, like 2-3 weeks and I've got all these questions. So within a few days, I sent them back. I answered everything. And then the microphone went dead until...
Right. Well, you have a campus with multiple buildings. And
no, we don't, no.
Oh, okay. I'm mixing up the...
North Shore Jewish Center is in Port Jeff Station, all the way out past Stony Brook.
Okay.
And we have one building.
Okay, I was confusing you with North Shore and Palindrome.
Right, I know. That's why I keep.
Okay, that's good. But they still have all these questions, and it takes longer than you expect. What are you buying?
Hardening doors, cameras, and a couple of window block out the windows.
You see my screen, Stephen?
Yeah, I do now. We have like a hallway that's all glass, and we're actually behind the arc where it's all glass. We're going to be putting in a vision panel there, so you can't see directly into the sanctuary, that kind of stuff.
So I'm glad David asked. So once you're still waiting on your EHP approval?
No. I got my EHP approval. No, I just say I thought it would happen like very quickly because the questions came back so fast. But I got my EHP approval the very end of March. So just like 10 days ago.
How long was that whole process for you? Just to see if my estimate
actually it was
correct.
like the end of December until the end of March.
So 3 months.
But I thought it was, I felt it was so straightforward from an EHP standpoint because we were doing nothing else. We were not disrupting soil anywhere outside the building. Everything we were doing was the building itself, but it still took from the end of December to the end of March.
How old is your building?
Well, the building, that's kind of the question. So the building is about 50 years old, which is 5 years over the 45-year mark.
Right.
But, it's not one of these, and it's a very actually good example of mid-century modern architecture, but it's not, it's not like a building that was built in 1893 that everybody's worried about.
So one of the things they have to do is to consult with the local authorities to make sure that, you're not subject to any of the local historic preservation
Right.
statutes.
Yeah, which we're not.
Right.
One thing we always
Just imagine if
advise,
you were.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
one thing we always advise, because you mentioned about not understanding why EHP was getting like that, is with all this stuff, whether EHP or all these steps, we tell everyone, don't get Talmudic. Follow the steps. We start overthinking and over designing, and it kind of makes the whole world crazier. It's really been step by step thought out for everybody, and just do those requirements. But there's a lot of pieces maybe we don't all understand, so just do it, right? And I'm glad David wrote what projects. Please, if your advertisement has been posted, please share it with us. We can help you get bidders if you still need. Again, we can't recommend, but we can share, especially door hardening, but all those other items. It helps if we know your budgets as well, just so we know, because some vendors, they have different appetites, different abilities, regions, etc. So while we still have a few more minutes, and hasn't been a lot of questions.
Since you mentioned doors, back in February, at the February 7th CSI seminar, Ilya said that you guys had door specs that we could ask for.
First of all, do you have an assessment from us?
Yes, it's like 40 pages long.
Right. First step, I'd go to your door hardening section, see if that helps you a little bit. And then write to, Liron and I were just talking about this yesterday, about the specs and about how we can provide it. It's hard because some locations want to just upgrade and not necessarily security rated. And then how do we advise for a minimum like security rating, what we advise? But I would do a couple things. One, write to Liron with your advertisement in your budgets, or maybe we can all do a call together. Jamie's on the call too. That's something we do provide. We do, one-on-one calls also. We try to do the consultant's corner just so there's that kind of availability for across the board. But as we get into the weeds with anyone, that is a service CSI provides. We don't always market it on consultant's corner because oftentimes it's, oh, we covered this. But I think it sounds like you've been a regular, and let's make sure we can be available for you. I don't know if it'll happen before Passover, but I'll talk to Liron on the side about the specs for you guys. In the last few minutes, there hasn't been a lot of other questions. I don't know, Jamie, if you're looking behind the scenes, I know you raised hands. I pulled up the slides, Stephen, on OGS contract purchasing, page 15 from the 22. You still need 3 bids. So that means you still need to get into OGS. You need to get responses from the right vendors for any of the projects you're doing. So you mentioned already a handful of projects. You'll need to get 3 bids for each one of them. You'll still have to score them, review them. That doesn't take so much time. It's the responsiveness and ability to do the projects you want that takes time. So and especially because it already costs, unfortunately, a few months to get that approval, whatever they're requiring now, on how to qualify, right here, to find out how to, if you qualify, right? You just said it took a few months, and it could take a few more to find the right vendors, if at all. If you get that paper out, the advertisement out, you can just start asking anybody. And if you don't get a response, you go down the road. Technically, you could still do that too, even with OGS. You can get bids from both. It actually doesn't stop you. So, try to get from OGS, and we can also put that advertisement out and get from the regular sources. But you couldn't reach out to non-OGS vendors without the advertising. So maybe you just have a double-pronged approach.
I mean, the amount of time on the OGS waiting for approval didn't bother me because I did it as soon as I had an executed contract. And so from the time I had the executed contract and the return of the EHP, I did the whole OGS thing during the dead period. So I didn't lose any time on it.
No, that's smart, and I don't disagree with that. It just, our experience is that they're not very responsive.
No, I appreciate that. I don't want to beat it. I'll take your opinion very seriously about how to approach it.
And
Exactly.
Stephen, I posted in the chat a link to our backgrounder on architectural hardware and what you should be thinking about in terms of doors, etc., doors and locks. If you download that, that's a good introductory document. We have used an architectural hardware consultant who's one of the top security people in the world.
I actually went back and watched that one. That was an old one from 22, I think, or 21
Yeah,
that you did, that lady. That
Carol.
was,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
that was very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the document that Carol produced for us. And so that's, good for homework.
Thank you, Stephen. No, it's good discussion. It's pieces we don't always get into, but we do find many locations that will ask us offline, so it's important to bring up. We're at that 11 o'clock hour. See any-
Roberta has a question. Is that okay?
Sure. We'll stay here if anyone needs to jump, but we'll be here till we get through the questions.
Okay, it really has to do with the submission of the grant for
Okay.
the FEMA grant and gleaning out, the vulnerability assessment, of course, can be as long as you want, and we have CSIs, and it gives you all the threats in many different ways. And in the IJ, you have to just glean out a summary of it. And we didn't get the grant last year. And we thought, and from the state rep said they recommended it, right? So it had to do with the competition. And we're listening to the FEMA webinars, I am, and he said 48% of the people got the grant and 52% of the people didn't last year. And I didn't realize that for the FEMA grant, we're also competing against private nonprofit schools. Whereas in the state grant, schools are not eligible to submit. So now with the Christian school shooting and things like that, that's a harder competition, I think. But that being said, summarizing the IJ and really gleaning the most important part of the threat section. And I was wondering, they said direct threats against your facility and or like facilities. So my assumption is to only now we're trying to tweak what was submitted last year, right? Because we didn't get it last year. So my assumption is it better just to do, we have some threats to ours, they're minor, in the world of threats, but they were reported to the police more since we submitted our grant last year. We've been more vigilant about reporting things to the police, so we have better documentation. But other threats, is it better just to do synagogues like Colleyville and the Molotov cocktail in New Jersey were the two recent ones? Further back historically is like Pittsburgh or California. Or should we also include, but it's not a threat to a synagogue, local community swastika graffiti? Is that not a good thing to stick it? I mean, everything is in the vulnerability assessment. So
Right.
we know that those are threats. It's what to glean in the IJ, which is only what FEMA is reading. And I don't
Right.
know who has a pulse on what FEMA scores. It doesn't seem our state rep does. He just said, well, we recommended you.
Okay,
Right.
so what we're doing here, this is from our tips and it's on the webpage. So number one, what happened to you? And you
Yes,
said
we
you've been
did that.
reporting to police, that's fine. Now, while historic risk may be included for context, the investment justification should focus on current threats and risks, not historic ones. Now, all of this language is gleaned specifically from either the judge's scoring sheet or the fine print of the releases from the government. Then, what happened locally and worldwide? You need to closely related or similar or nearby facilities. And then it says to make the connection that you are at risk for the same reasons. What is your facility, Roberta?
Port Jewish Center. We're a small synagogue on the North Shore of Long Island, and we are located we're not a standalone campus. So we're located like next to we share a parking lot with commercial buildings. So like it's impossible to identify, suspicious people because they all are suspicious to us, right? So my question is, David, is something like graffiti, local graffiti on a local school near us or within our own school or in a police outlet, is that considered enough of a threat, graffiti, or does it have to be a bomb threat or
any of these threats, you just have to make the connection that we know that there, example language. We know that there was graffiti on the local school and on the Pale building, in the last year. And since we are in the same neighborhood, we are identifiable as a synagogue and we share a parking lot, we are at risk of an attack for those reasons. You have to make the connection.
Okay, thank you.
And, then we go into, use this kind of language. This is all in the tips. All of this was updated, kind of redid a lot of this from the original 228 presentation.
Oh, and where are the tips? Help me. I'm actually in a car. Usually I'm on my desk writing, but I'm
JCRC-NY.org/security grants. And even if you go to JCRC-NY.org/security, there's a green box on the left side that's a table of contents.
Okay, and then this is going to be on Consultants Corner, this webinar, right?
Yeah, today.
It will be on the
It's not going to be on
archive.
Consultants Corner until next week because our poster is on vacation.
Okay, thank you.
All righty. Well, thank you, everybody. We know it's coming up onto Passover and grant application season, and you're coming here to give ourselves mental exercise with these procurement flowcharts and grant rules. But kudos to all of you for pushing through. Again, your RSDs, like you've heard throughout the people participating on the call, are available to you. Ourselves. So kosher v'sameach. Happy holidays to everybody else. All right, thank you very much. Enjoy.